Water brought most of our ancestors to this continent. And water took them westward into it. Water was their road to freedom and sometimes riches, their source of inspiration and adventure. That's also true on the driftwood for a group of young people right out of college. With video cameras, they embarked on a 25,000-mile voyage, gathering stories along the way. Their adventure took 3 years and covered the eastern part of North America from Nova Scotia to the Gulf of Mexico. They wanted to find out how the waterways influence our lives. And in turn, what we have done to the water. Travel with them to visit the places and meet the people they discovered along the way. A songwriter who, in the tradition of Mark Twain, pilots a steam-driven paddle wheeler. An authentic river rat who grew up on the backwater and now runs a bar right on its banks. And Tom Sawyer and Becky Thatcher. Join them on this leg of their journey as they explore the Mississippi River. There's a story behind this story. It all began as an idea shared by a father and a son. But the son, an award-winning filmmaker, died in an auto accident. His father decided to go ahead with the project as a kind of memorial. He bought a 60-foot motor yacht, named it Driftwood, and outfitted it with television equipment. He hired a professional crew to run the boat. Then he selected teams of Canadian and U.S. college graduates, young people who, like his son, wanted to share their discoveries with others. They signed on for about a month each. They got room and board, a salary, and a chance to help document what they saw on the waters. Bill Arnold from Canada's Mohawk College was one of the first selected. He became a permanent member of the Driftwood video crew. Tom Miller from the University of Florida joined Bill for this trip.
I was excited about it, and as I got the tour and met the people, I felt like after a couple of days I was home. This is where I was going to spend the next couple of months of my life. I don't know what's going to happen or what's going to be around the next bend, but I'm ready to take it on, whatever it might be.
The reflecting pools of Lake Itasca form the headwaters of the Mississippi. They begin as a series of sloughs and marshes located in the northwest corner of Minnesota. The river is calm here and tiny. You can actually walk across it. But as it begins to flow from Minnesota's north woods through glacial lakes to the south, the river gathers strength. The Mississippi becomes a series of rapids doubling back and forth through farms and timberland. Years ago, the power generated by its rushing waters helped create a thriving mill town. Today, Minneapolis is the largest city in Minnesota. Along with its sister city of St. Paul, it has become a major business hub with companies like Pillsbury, Control Data, and 3M. The Mississippi no longer plays a big role in the economy here, but beneath the skyline are communities that recall the days when lumber and grain mills crowded its banks. It was here, where the Mississippi first becomes navigable, that Driftwood began its journey downriver. The Mississippi cuts right through the continental United States, forming the natural border for 10 states, from Minnesota in the north to Louisiana in the south. It's the dividing point of the nation. How many times have you heard people say they lived either east of the Mississippi or west of it? But its mystique is what inspires artists and authors, poets and songwriters. Almost immediately, Bill and Tom met someone who knew about that.
My first trip on driftwood, we headed down the river, and right there, tucked away by a power plant, was this old rustic-looking houseboat.
Floating neighborhoods are common along the Mississippi. Usually, these groups of houseboats collect in the backwaters, away from the rest of civilization. But in Minneapolis-St. Paul, they're parked right by the side of the river, part of the city, part of the flow.
When I turn right when I get up here? No, just go right in towards the boat alongside it.
Went aboard and met Susan Winter.
Susan is a freelance writer. She is hired to do articles on subjects her clients choose. But when she writes for herself, she writes about the river. Like this entry from her journal. I am up at 6:30 to sit in the straw chair by the window in a corner of the kitchen, riverside. The sun has not yet made it round the point, though I can see it slanting through the far side trees and on the water. Flat, glassy, calm surface, hiding all that power, all that surging life.
This is a beautiful place to write, and just staring out at the water, stories come to me. There is nothing, I think, quite so beautiful as a flowing body of water, you know, beautiful to see and beautiful for the soul.
She lives her life right there, watching the river go by. Whatever happens, happens right in front of her. And so she could have a blank page and see a tug and tow go by, and see some people interacting on the tug and tow, and that'll just click a whole story for her.
Susan makes just enough money from her writing to afford to live on her houseboat. As a little girl, Susan used to lie beside the river and pretend she was an otter. She wanted to spend her whole life by the water. Yet when she had the chance to buy the houseboat, Susan was a little hesitant. Then she had a dream. In it, the boat floated above the water. Susan willed it back to earth and tied it to the shore with colored ribbons.
It convinced me. I woke up from it just like that and thought, the boat, you know, it's just the right thing to do.
She christened the boat Sweet Dreams.
Especially when the children were little, I would put them to bed by telling them sweet dreams, river sweets. And it stuck in my mind, but I remembered how I used to say that. And it seemed, yes, this is sweet dreams down here. You can pretty much just live as people lived 100 years ago down here. Waking up on the river, you wake up to reflected yellow light on the ceiling. Even in the wintertime, I'll sit out on the bank and just listen to the ice tinkling around the boat, you know, like bells. This is something that God made, like an ocean or a vast forest. I mean, it has its own power and its own sense of being. And here we are, just like my fantasy as a kid used to be, like little otters on the edge.
She loves it there. I don't think there's a better place for her that she could be.
She's very much a part of the river.
That's true of many people living on the upper Mississippi.
I can see where they get their inspiration. Writers, filmmakers, a variety of people who come to Mississippi.
As Bill and Tom headed south, they would meet others like Susan who were drawn to the river and who can think of living nowhere else. It took a day to reach Red Wing, Minnesota. It is located on the sharpest bend of the Mississippi. At one time, Red Wing was the primary wheat market in the world. And until the railroads came in the 1870s, all the grain was shipped by river. Even when Red Wing became known for other things, the town did not turn its back on the Mississippi. Businesses still flourish along the waterfront. One of those is the Harbor Bar, situated on an island directly across the river from downtown Red Wing.
It's small, but it's very popular in that whole area, being that it's right at the water. People can come up and tie their boats, sailboats, power boats. People are water skiing up to the dock.
How you doing, Brad?
Good, how you doing?
Good.
Brad Smith owns the harbor bar.
He's very warm and open guy. He's got a good thing going there.
Brad has worked at the bar since he was 12, doing odd jobs for his mom. Later, he helped run it. He met his wife, Patty, there, and finally, when his mother retired, he bought it.
It's something I always wanted to do. I like the area here. You're gonna have to pry me off of the island here, away from the river. You can't get me away from the river.
Picture Tom Sawyer grown up and running a bar, and you have Brad Smith.
Hey, don't look at the camera, Brad.
Delicious.
We're always messing around the river. I mean, if I didn't come home with my pants and my shoes wet up to my knees, my mother knew I was in trouble because I was someplace she didn't want me to be. So we had our little raft, kind of like Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. It was always something you always fantasized, head down the river to Louisiana, you know. And there goes under here in all the trees.
Now Brad's son Josh is growing up on the river.
Most definitely, he is a river rat. Like, you can't keep him away from the river.
Whenever they can, Brad and Josh take their duck boat out to the backwater.
What do you want that one? It's really quiet back there. You know, it's just you and the nature. Yeah. I thought we'd scare up a whole bunch of... It's a big old white one down there. I haven't seen near as many beaver back here with this drought. Foot.
I turn around, I hear this duck call, and I turn around, and here's Tom sitting down with Josh, blowing out the duck call, trying to figure out whether or not ducks are going to be flying over top.
Well, if there was any wildlife around here, they're gone now.
It's almost sort of a romantic lifestyle that he's living there. He has his wife, his son Josh. They're down to the water constantly.
Brad was quick to point out, though, that there's a lot of work living on the river because you got to be concerned about the flooding that always happens.
I can remember going up and seeing the water come up and down many times.
Brad's first flood happened the year after his parents bought the bar in 1965. Brad was 6. In the next 10 years, there were 3 more.
The thing you do at the bar is you just get everything that you don't need and pack it up and get it on high ground.
Then came the flood of '86. Brad was married by then, and he and Patty were running the bar.
I had to put on a pair of waders for the first time in my life. When we would open both doors to the bar, the water would flow through and you'd get a little current going through and some fish would come in.
We had like the old water bucket brigade, only it was cases of booze and beer going out the building. It's kind of hard to keep yourself in a good mood when you're looking at the financial losses of the flood and the damage that gets done to everything. But you know, it's part of living on the river, and you gotta take what comes and make the best out of it the best way you can.
Brad was the first person on the Mississippi to tell the crew about the floods he's had to endure. He would not be the last.
Kind of reminds me of the people who stay by in hurricanes down in Florida. I mean, they are insistent upon staying by their houses.
Living on the Mississippi is a trade-off. Even though being close to the water makes Brad vulnerable to floods, he likes the fact that he and his family can walk right out their door and jump in. And he says the beauty alone is worth staying for. One of the prettiest spots on the river is just southeast of Red Wing, where it opens up to form Lake Pepin. Thousands of years ago, when the glaciers melted, the rocks and dirt that were washed away formed a natural dam, flooding the Mississippi and creating the lake. Its beauty inspired William Cullen Bryant to write that it ought to be visited in the summer by every poet and painter in the land.
We came upon a small town, Stockholm, Wisconsin. And in this small town, they were having a festival that day, Arts and Craft Festival.
Did you decide what you wanted to drink?
At the festival, we met a very energetic lady, lively, whose name is Nadine.
Of all the artists here, Nadine Nelson is most closely connected to the Mississippi. Her specialty is jewelry, made with, believe it or not, pearls she gets from the river. Nadine is Moroccan, but she came to Minneapolis to study art. After graduation, she and her husband, a painter, settled here. That was about 20 years ago.
They, as most artists do, look for sources of creativity, and just like Susan Winter, found their source of inspiration along the Mississippi River in Stockholm. And not only the source of inspiration, but the source for her jewelry.
She creates her designs right in the shop.
Beautiful things, these pearls. Now she makes all kinds of necklaces and earrings and all kinds of jewelry with them.
She had an overflow of energy, very enthusiastic, motivated, constantly moving. Everybody, from Brad up at Harbor Point and people from south of there, they all know Nadine. How can you not get to know or know of or hear of Nadine?
She's the pearl lady.
You could pick one of these.
Nadine discovered Mississippi pearls by accident.
I went in an antique store around here and saw a hat pin with a nice Mississippi pearl and asked, you know, about it. And they said that they had in the old days, there were pearls here, but they said there wasn't any more. And myself, I figured if they had been once, there was no reason why there shouldn't be again.
She had never heard before of, just like us, I had never heard of that. Pearls from the Mississippi. I guess since she hooked up with Doc.
Doc Emanuel ran a shell camp, which is where clammers keep their catch from the river. They boil out the meat and sell the shells. But once in a while, Doc told Nadine, they find real pearls.
There was big piles of clamshell in his yard, and my eyes went down, and the first thing I saw was that clam with the big pearl on the lip.
Seeing is believing, and Nadine lost no time getting to another camp.
When I got there, they started the cooker, you know, to separate the meat and the shell, and a pearl fell by my foot. And I looked down, you know, and there she was, and oh gosh, right there, and then I just was hooked. I was hooked between the clam I found with the pearl on the lip and that deal. Changed my whole life. That's all I do now. In the quest of pearls. No, it's
not as easy as it sounds. On average, you get about a teaspoon of pearls for every ton of clams. And it's getting harder and harder to find good clams, let alone pearls.
That's chalk.
That's no good, right?
Nope, no way.
No one knows for sure why the clams are dying out, but Doc has a pretty good idea.
There's too much waste and too much pollution being poured into the river, out of sight, out of mind. We are downriver from most of it at this area. We catch it. This is the first wide spot in the river, and it makes a nice septic tank.
Right. Like this year and last year we didn't have much rain. Well, the river is going down, down, down. Well, that's bound to affect it because it's making more concentration of the chemical, you know, on less space. So it's affecting the clam. And the pearls are getting smaller. Look at a little 3-inch.
Low water levels were affecting everyone that summer, not just clammers. The entire time driftwood was on the river, the nation was going through a drought, the worst in a century.
We encountered people all along the way where the drought touched their lives, and I remember every day hoping with them that it would rain.
Day after day, temperatures reached 100 with no relief in sight. Then one day, it finally rained.
And I could just picture hundreds of farmers standing out their back door, just with arms outstretched to the sky, thanking God that it finally started to rain.
Unfortunately, it didn't last. What's more, it didn't rain again for the rest of the trip. The crew heard reports that further downriver, the water had dropped below 9 feet, not enough to float a loaded barge. They also heard that river traffic on the lower Mississippi was at a standstill. But the upper Mississippi has a system of locks and dams designed to create pools deep enough for barges, even in times of drought. Below each structure, the water makes great holding tanks for sports fish native to the river, like largemouth bass, carp, walleye, and bluegill. One of these pools lies near Lynxville, Wisconsin, and Ken and Bobby Fleschner are taking advantage of it. They run the Lynxville Fish Float and Diner on an island about 100 yards south of Lock and Dam number 9. A fish float is just what it sounds like. A dock that juts out in the water so people can fish offshore without having to bother with a boat.
It was just quite a sight to see. The people out there fishing, having a great time.
Oh, there goes my worm. There goes.
But fishing for a living is not easy, even when you're not doing the fishing yourself. First, Ken and Bobby had to get a river pilot's license so they could pick up their customers from shore and take them back to the island. Then they had to fix the place up.
The railings were falling off, you know, and it wasn't hardly safe to walk on. Half the floorboards were missing, or they had holes and big patches on them. It was in pretty rough shape.
It was Ken's idea to buy the fish float in the first place. He knew he might be laid off from John Deere, and since he and Bobby liked to fish...
I made you buy it.
He made me. I didn't want any part of this.
She didn't want any part of it, but I talked to her and told her she'd never have to cook. My mom came up, she was going to be her cook, and she lasted about a month. Want to try another one?
They bought it in February, on Bobby's birthday, and worked day and night for the next month.
March 17th, we were coming across at midnight.
Hauling the unit just saw in there with all the jigs.
So that we could open on the 18th
We
of
hauled
March.
that up this river through paths that we made in the ice.
They had only 4 regular customers all spring, and within a month after they opened, the flood that swept through Brad Smith's bar hit the fish float. That fall, the Mississippi flooded again.
Kenny kept wanting to give up. After we got here, he had to talk me into buying it. But once we got here, I don't quit anything. I don't care how bad I have to fight. Somehow we're gonna make it.
3 years later, they're still not making a profit, but they're earning enough to pay their bills.
Hey, how you doing?
And Ken and Bobby are building a following.
They love it. They love the idea that there's regulars there. They call everybody by name.
Frank, Merle, and Jim. And I don't even know what to tell you. They're like family too. And I'd be afraid to turn this over to somebody else. And I'd be afraid they wouldn't be treated the way that I think they should be. Because it's like they're part of this.
Kenny, gotta get out of the way. We're watching TV.
Even the diner attached to the fish float seems more like the Fleschner's kitchen. They take turns cooking.
Yeah, take 2 of those pieces.
Who's not talking?
Around 11:30 or 12 o'clock, they all pile in from a hard mornings of fishing and have their grilled cheese sandwiches and burgers and sit around and tell fish stories.
And there's a board that is just plastered with Polaroid snapshots of every conceivable fish in that area, and it's sort of like their own family portrait.
Everybody knows exactly where their picture is. I mean, there's no question at all. They'll walk right up and, that's me. That's the one I caught last year. The people that are fishing along there watch the river go by. They see the flowing of the river. They see the boats go by. They see the dam along there.
And we're just another extension of the river for them. We're floating by. We're going to touch their lives. They're going to touch our lives, but we'll constantly keep flowing, and the river will keep moving.
The boat headed downriver through Wisconsin and Iowa, one of the prettiest stretches on the Mississippi. For over 100 miles, high limestone bluffs tower along the banks.
As you're sitting aboard driftwood, and watching this go by, you could almost say it's like we've been transformed back 100 years to an era, to a time that once was but will never be again.
It's easy to see why Bill felt that way. From the deck of the driftwood, it was hard to find any sign of civilization. With towns set back from the river, the Mississippi looks a lot like it did in 1673, when French explorers Marquette and Joliet first paddled their canoes out of the Wisconsin River onto what the Indians call the Father of Waters. Within a few years of Marquette and Joliet's discovery, the Mississippi proved the Indians right. It became a path for settlement and later a conduit for commerce. Towns like Dubuque, Iowa grew up on the river and used it for shipping. In this region, the product was lead. During the Civil War, it was used for lead shot. By then, 95% of the world's supply came from here. Galena, Illinois, across the river from Dubuque, took its name from the Latin word for lead. At one point, 10,000 people worked in Galena's mines, and most of what they mined was transported by steamboat. A 150 years ago, there were 11,000 steam-driven paddle wheels on the Ohio and the Mississippi. Now, there are 5. Every other day during the summer, one of these steamboats takes passengers from Galena on a trip. That boat is the Julia Bell Swain.
Oh, the Julia Bell Swain is a mighty fine boat. I got a mighty fine captain, too. Got a big red wheel that goes around and a bunch of old hippies for a crew. Well, I can't stay here, well, I gotta get away.
There were times where we would see just the boats and no town, no land or anything, and we'd see these stern-wheeling river boats going by.
It was like a little window had opened for us, allowing us to look back in a period of time.
Mark Twain so loved these boats, he was inspired to write about them. They are, he said, as beautiful as a wedding cake, but without the complications. John Hartford feels the same way, but he writes it differently.
When the Julia Bell comes to declare, you know that summer's here. Up on the Mississippi River, that's the very best time of the year. Those steamboat days in July like a hazy, lazy dream.
John Hartford is a celebrated musician, best known for composing the popular song Gentle on My Mind. Whenever he's not performing around the country, he's on the river on the Julia Bell Swain.
My art is based on you do what's in your heart, and if people like it, that's fine. And if they don't, you haven't wasted your time.
Hartford first fell in love with the river from stories his 5th grade teacher used to tell in St. Louis.
I don't know, there was something that went click. That was it, and by the time I was in the 6th grade, I was totally immersed.
As soon as he turned 17, John got a job as a deckhand on a barge line. But music proved to be a stronger draw, and it led him away from the river.
And one summer, I got off of a towboat, and I took a job in a dance hall in South St. Louis, and I thought to myself, well, I just do this for a couple of weeks, and then I'll go back on the river. And then I didn't go back for about 9 years.
Dennis Trone, captain of the Julia Bell Swain, reunited John with his first love. One day, he let Hartford have the wheel, and John knew he was back where he belonged. He became a river pilot, a kind of modern-day Mark Twain.
And he looks out on the Mississippi River, and he goes down and he brings that back home to the passengers in his conversation and his actions and the songs that he sings.
What's the secret that...
I'll see if I can get you to steer it as easily as I can.
Well, John offered to allow me to pilot the Julia Bell Swain.
Of course, you can use that mast out there to tell you which way. Yeah,
Tell you which way.
Don't leave me, John.
Tell you which way the boat's swinging.
Here I am on the Mississippi River, the world famous Mississippi River, piloting a true riverboat. It was a warm feeling. It really was.
John Hartford couldn't put it into words, and I can't either. I remember going up there with him at night and watching him pilot the boat and watching the shore go by, and everybody was quiet for a while, and it's awe-inspiring up there.
Brew captains round a tin can, I pretend to hold you to my breast and find that you're waving from the back roads by the rivers of my memory, ever smiling and ever gentle on my mind.
The Mississippi is made up of many rivers. More than 100 tributaries flow into its path. The Rock River is one of them, draining some of the most fertile agricultural land in the nation.
Oh, jeez. Holy cow. Woo!
Rodney Bessie owns a farm on the Rock, not far from the Mississippi in Erie, Illinois. But even though he's not right on the Mississippi, Rod is vulnerable. Because when it floods, the Rock can too, and then so does Rod's farm.
I chased hogs out in the field with a pair of hip boots on up under my armpits. I mean, when your hip boots are full of water and you got a hog trying to swim ahead of you, and you just keep going, you know. Of course, I suppose the water keeps you revived. The fact is, when my dad got married in '37, the road was washed out then. And during the 40 years that my dad farmed it, why, he lost 8 crops. So you figure about every 5 years why you're going to get hit by the river.
Talking with people like Brad at Harbor Bar and Bobby and Ken at the Fish Float, it was very hard to put it in perspective. It finally, I think, hit home for me, it did at least, when we got to Rod's and had seen these massive dikes which he had built around his farm in order to divert the water away from his land and keep it on its course down the Rock River towards the Mississippi.
Like a lot of people living along the river, Rod won't consider relocating. His property is a centennial farm. It's been in his family for over 100 years.
He takes a lot of pride in that, and I don't think he'd leave it for anything. And I think that's part of his strength, and that he's willing to endure whatever the Rock River or the Mississippi River or whatever the climate might bring.
I'm not scared of the river. I've swam in it all my life. I've swam across it. I lived in it when I was a kid, and I used to know where every sandbar was, every deep place was, every hole there was, all the way down through here.
Why do you think he plays football, huh? He can catch him long pass.
The river isn't always an adversary. In times of drought like this summer, it seeps into the surrounding land and keeps it from drying out. So while others were losing their crops due to lack of rain, Rod was able to keep farming.
When people start talking about working in their garden, well, that's what I'm doing. I have a 400-acre garden. And I enjoy working the ground, working and building fence, working with hogs, anything that's got anything to do with farming.
Make the old barn look like new.
These days, it's a hard way to make a living. Over half the farmers in America have had to take a second job just to make ends meet. And Rod is one of them. In fact, he has been working 2 jobs for 21 years, starting right after his first flood.
It put me back about $100,000. And I had to look around everywhere I could to come up with financial help to keep the farm.
Rod got a job at the John Deere plant in East Moline, Illinois. He's a night supervisor, working a full 8-hour shift after spending all day on the farm. Although he'd rather be in the fields, he's found the next best thing, working with farm machinery.
Most people that invest money in a piece of property, why they have another way of making a living. But a farmer, he invests his whole life into it. And not only does he have the land, but he has his equipment, and you can tie up a lot of money. And it takes a long time to pay it back, you know. Deere has been real good, been a good employer, a good provider, and I like working down there.
The company is the world's largest manufacturer of farm equipment and one of the oldest. It's been in Moline since 1846, when founder John Deere moved his plow business to the Mississippi to take advantage of its water power and transportation. A rich river economy had begun to develop in the area, creating not one, but 4 major cities, 2 on the Illinois side and 2 on the Iowa side. Moline, Rock Island, Davenport, and Bettendorf came to be known as the Quad Cities. The Mississippi changes its direction here, heading west for a while before turning back south. Legend has it that as the Father of Waters came through this area on his way down to the Gulf of Mexico, he looked to his right. He was so taken with the beauty of the passing scenery, he changed his course. A lot of history took place on this bend of the river. Davenport was a gateway to the west. Settlers waited until they crossed the river before buying supplies. Once they reached the other side, many went no further. As the country grew, so did Davenport. And as river traffic increased, navigation became a problem. The water was low at this part of the Mississippi, and chains of rocks extended from either shore. The combination created rapids which even shallow-keeled steamboats had trouble crossing, and there were other obstacles besides. In 1856, the first railroad bridge to cross the Mississippi was built here. Even before it was completed, a steamboat, the Effie Afton, ran into the bridge, burned, and sank. The steamboat company sued the railroad for building a river hazard. A young lawyer just starting out took the railroad side and won. His name? Abraham Lincoln. A few years earlier, a young officer by the name of Robert E. Lee had come to survey this part of the river. On his recommendation, a channel was dug to submerge the rapids. As river traffic moved away from flat-bottom boats, the channel had to be dug deeper. By 1931, barges carrying bulk goods had replaced steamboats carrying passengers. To accommodate this shift to larger boats, Lock and Dam number 15 was built. About 25,000 barges go through this lock each year, carrying grain, coal, and petroleum products. They rarely come down the river one at a time. In fact, on average, 15 barges are strung together, forming what they call a tow. Tows this size, about the length of 4 football fields, can carry as much grain as 2 freight trains. Sometimes cargo is dropped off as tows head along the river, leaving empty barges. To reduce the size of the tows and make travel easier, barge lines look for ways to get rid of the excess baggage. That's where Williams Marine comes in. With their boats, Mark Williams and his brothers come up alongside a tow, unhook the empty barges, and haul them off to a fleeting area until they're needed again.
So we were the little water bugs of the industry, and we'd move these barges around to facilitate the constant movement of the line boats.
At one time, the Williams brothers were the only ones offering this service on this part of the river. In fact, their father pioneered the idea.
My father had been on the line towboats, towing cargoes from Houston to St. Paul, St. Louis to Pittsburgh for some 34 years. And at that point, he decided that with his 3 indigent sons, who would never get a job on their own, he'd better start a company of his own.
It provided steady work for Mark and his brothers.
We cleaned barges after they'd been loaded with coal, make them ready for grain, and then put them back in our fleet. When a towboat would come back down that was designated to pick up that particular barge, we'd put it on him.
It's not a 9-to-5 proposition. If a tow needs servicing here at 2 a.m., there's usually a Williams brother making the call.
So we would have 55 hour days where you see the sun come up 3 times and never close your eyes, things like, horror stories that are absolutely true. But it steeled us, I guess, for future adversity. And we take things in stride, I think, that would probably hurt other people devastatingly.
You can wave them all in.
I think that they provide us a very personal service to these people who are on board the Tug and Tows. These people are on the water all the time. They spend a lot of time away from their family, and the Williams brothers are probably a source of something to look forward to go over and talk to them.
Don is the oldest.
We believe that we are affectionately called the Three Little Pigs. Certainly we are called that. I think it's with affection.
Brother Larry agrees.
I've got to compliment both my brothers. I think that they're a very good reason why things have worked, because neither one of them are argumentative, and not when it get, we argue and josh back and forth, but we always keep it good-natured.
But Williams Marine is going out of business, and not by choice. Barge lines are consolidating, and there's no room for the little guy anymore.
Instead of 100 different people out here working in the towing industry, they'll probably wind up 5 or 6 that are just like the railroads have done.
I don't think that's a bad idea for America, because the floating ton is still the cheapest. But a byproduct of that, I think, is it makes people like my family, my brothers and I, dinosaurs. The old mom and pop store is about gone.
Their business was going to be no more in a matter of weeks, and they seemed very up for some reason. They went into it head on, thinking that this business was going to perhaps make them and allow them to live the rest of their life comfortably. As it turned out, the dream didn't come true.
And it again parallels the Bessie Farm and everything else. Things are changing. Times are changing along the Mississippi River.
It's better than we did yesterday, right?
These 3 brothers are going to face it, and they're facing it very strongly.
But I'm going to miss seeing my ugly brothers every day. I really will.
We'll definitely miss just the fellowship with one another. You got 2 best friends automatically, and they can't even get mad at you. They walk away.
I mean, I think those 3 guys get a lot out of the river. Not just an occupation, and whether their occupation is on the river or not, I think they'll be back.
I love the river. I don't think I'll go to a lake, a body of water that isn't going someplace and doing something. To me, is just a tub with a mud bottom. What do you do in it? Bathe in it, or let fish have their way with each other? I like a body of water that's doing something, and I guess that's just because I've been around it for so long.
Mark had told us about an area on the Mississippi, south of where his business presently is, that if we were to walk along the shoreline, we would find shells which would have almost perfect circles cut right through them. And it was true.
They look like the fossilized remains of some prehistoric animal piled on the riverbanks near Muscatine, Iowa. But they don't date back quite that far. In 1889, a German immigrant came to town claiming that mussel shells from this part of the Mississippi would be a perfect source for pearl buttons. No one believed him until he started his own factory and began making money, lots of it. Soon the riverbanks were filled with button factories, and it seemed like everyone in town owned a clam boat. Muscatine became known as the button-making capital of the world. Some of the original factories are still operating in town, but they make buttons out of plastic now, not shell. And there are hardly any clam boats around anymore. In fact, you're more likely to find people playing on the river instead of working. As the driftwood headed out of town, they had company. 200 canoers setting out on a 6-day trip downriver. 149 miles from Muscatine to Hannibal, Missouri.
Here we are floating in a twin-engine, nice relaxing vessel, and these people are all out there sweating and struggling. And at one point where they kind of suggested they'd like to trade places and they'd rather be on our boat.
As driftwood traveled the Mississippi, it drew a lot of attention. There were other working boats on the river, but they didn't look like pleasure yachts, and none of them had a video crew sleeping on board.
It was great, living on a boat. It has its advantages and its disadvantages. I think me being a rather large person, the confines of the room and the bed I slept in was a little tight. But that was about the worst it ever got. It's a working vessel. We live on it, we work on it. We hundreds and hundreds of times have loaded equipment in and out the doors, down the steps, onto whatever dock we're at. What's going on, Renee?
Great.
Beautiful.
Your day?
Oh, lovely. But it's fun. It's a different life than I had ever experienced before. It's a moving thing. It's a living thing. You're on the boat and you can go from the engine room or your room, go to the middle, come up top and lounge up top and watch the Mississippi flow by.
Driftwood headed for Hannibal, Missouri. It was a town the crew felt they knew because of one man.
When people think Hannibal, Missouri, they think of immediately, the first thing that pops into their mind would perhaps be Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, the writer.
Twain grew up here, and some of his best-known stories take place in this little river town. He wrote about the things he knew, but first he changed the names. Holiday Hill became Cardiff Hill. He named a nearby island Jackson Island, and he called the character, partially based on himself, Tom Sawyer.
You want to see what Mark Twain had seen and what he had seen through his writing. And if you look for it, you'll find it. You definitely will find it.
The place is living on the legend of Mark Twain. It really is. I mean, they have the Becky Thatcher bookstore, the Mark Twain this, the Samuel Clemens that, the Tom Sawyer whatever. As we were walking along the streets, we saw Tom and Becky.
Since 1956, Hannibal's 7th graders have competed annually for the chance to play those roles.
The young people will practice and study for this for an entire year in hopes of being chosen as a Tom or a Becky. And in turn, they will represent the city of Hannibal and allowing people that may not know of Tom Sawyer or Becky Thatcher to see how they may have dressed, what kind of young people they were.
The year Driftwood came through town, the honor went to Eric Wilms and Julie Comer.
And I think it's a treat for the tourists that both Tom and Becky are there right in front of Mark Twain's home, and they're able to talk with them.
They're typical American kids. Eric skis, Julie has friends, and yet they have been chosen to live a bit of the past and represent some of history.
This is my brass doorknob I got for conning some of my buddies in the painting the fence.
They have their parts down to a T. Eric, as Tom, knows everything he keeps in his little bag.
Got an andiron knob I give Becky. I got this for painting the fence too.
Julie, as Becky, has her roll down just as well.
Tom and Becky went to a school picnic with all their friends, and they went into the cave. After a while, Becky couldn't hear the other kids' voices anymore.
Becky was really scared and everything, was starting to cry. So Tom took some kite string out of his bag and tied it to Becky's finger and started venturing off on hands and knees in pitch darkness.
Tom saw a light coming around the corner, so he yelled out because he thought it might be the other group.
Is that you? Hey, we're over here. Oh, man!
It was Injun Joe, And so he got Becky, and they went down the passageway. And what seemed like days, they finally found a light, and it was a passageway out, so they got rescued.
I think it'd be a blast to go around and relive some of the past like that.
The Mississippi, I think, still holds the same fascination it did when Samuel Clemens was writing about it. The magnitude of the river is phenomenal. The history it possesses, the breadth, it's very hard to describe. I personally am in love with the Mississippi.
As every single turn will bring a different vista, will bring different people, a different town, a whole different view of the river. And I found myself at every story wondering what the river might bring farther down south.
You get a perspective of everything from the river, and then you begin to get the feeling, the surging, pulsating rhythm of life and vitality that must permeate this country.
We gather in this old meeting house, as we have on other occasions across the summer months, in keeping with a faith and a legacy that was given to us by men and women who preceded us to this place.
Robert Tapscott is a Presbyterian minister. During the summer, he preaches at an old meeting house outside St. Louis. It dates back to 1833, when a man named Elijah Lovejoy was minister here.
Elijah Lovejoy was an abolitionist who fought against slavery when doing that was highly unacceptable. Reverend Tapscott became obsessed with this guy.
When I came to St. Louis in 1970 to take the job as the minister of the Parish Presbyterian Church, and someone mentioned Elijah Lovejoy, I just began, because of my background in history, to ask questions about it.
Tapscott learned that long before the Civil War, Lovejoy enlarged his pulpit with a printing press. He began publishing his views against slavery. Eventually, he was run out of town by Southern sympathizers. Lovejoy fled to Illinois, where he continued to write.
He crosses the Mississippi to Alton to Free State. He thinks it's a free state. He shouldn't die in Alton. Should be able to get away with stuff in Alton, but he can't, because the economy on the river is such that Southern influences are coming upriver.
2 of his presses were stolen and dumped in the river. Others were vandalized. Then, in November 1837, an angry crowd descended on Lovejoy, who was hiding out near the river. Elijah Lovejoy was killed that night. Tapscott calls it the first dress rehearsal for the Civil War.
What you can draw from the shootout in Alton in 1837 along the river is that we were on a calamitous course, a collision course, that would result in the terrifying upheaval of blood and thunder that would spill across the land.
But in St. Louis, he found...
As Tapscott learned more about Lovejoy, he felt compelled to tell others. He made a documentary. Now he's planning a book. And he still makes pilgrimages to Lovejoy's grave in Alton.
I don't think he set out to die. But there comes a time in which you can't sacrifice your basic opinion. It's just not negotiable. It's just not for sale. We don't have many leaders like that today.
So this stone was set here last year.
He was probably one of the first true, brave spokespeople for the First Amendment and what that stands for.
The same issues that Lovejoy faced, we face them today. Freedom of the press, the right of speech, the right to think, the right to be critical, the right to participate. Lovejoy's spirit lives because somewhere there is an editor facing the fact that his editorial has got to say more. It's got to cut deeper.
People like Reverend Tapscott bring history alive. He wants it to be known that this happened on the Mississippi River.
Again, the symbol of the river, the Missouri and the Mississippi met in Alton. They collided. Lovejoy, representing freedom and justice and all those good altruistic things, collides with intransigence and slavery. And that's why when I talk about him, I always go for the river as my historical analogy and as my contemporary example.
It's only been in the last 50 years that we've been able to exert some control over the Mississippi. In that time, people have begun to think of the river as a national treasure, like the bald eagle or the Statue of Liberty. And as the driftwood came into St. Louis, there was a celebration going on under the arch.
And everybody had come together for this festival to celebrate the Mississippi River, which is a terrific way to end it, the gateway to the West.
Water skiers from Minnesota, canoers from Iowa, paddle wheelers from Mississippi and Louisiana, people from every state the Mississippi touches. All here to show their appreciation to a river Mark Twain called a wonderful book, which told its mind to me without reserve, delivering its most cherished secrets as clearly as if it had uttered them with a voice.
I think I can understand why when we mention to people that we are traveling the length of the Mississippi River, they are a little jealous.
And I think it's an opportunity, once again, that is unique, and it's going to be a memory which will last a lifetime. And we've traveled the upper Mississippi and met a diverse group of people who are making their living, their existence on the river.
We have riders, we have performers, we have people who take their occupation from the water, whether it be shells, pearls, words, songs. These people all get from the Mississippi River, and then they in turn give it back. But I think it's the best way to really get a full understanding of what's going on along the river, to see it from the point of view of people who live it. By us seeing it from that point of view, we live it as well.
In the weeks ahead, join the crew of the Driftwood as they travel more than 25,000 miles and rediscover the stories along the waterways that link the people of North America with one another and the rest of the world. Come along as they explore man's relationship with the water he treasures and despoils, plays with and fights with, and cannot live without. Join these young people on the next leg of On the Waterways.
Funding for this program was provided by the Bamana Corporation of Fort Wayne, Indiana.